Hello, and welcome to Stories from India, a podcast where we talk about myths, legends, and folk tales from India. I am your host, Narad Muni, and I'm a mythological character myself. I have the gift of eternal life and knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. By profession, I'm a traveling musician and a storyteller. So, the way I'm doing my job is by podcast. In this episode, we'll see that the consequences of not inviting your son in law to a party could be as drastic as an involuntary head transplant. If your son in law is the destroyer. Now, in this context, the destroyer is not a ship in the Navy, and neither is it a comic book villain from Asgard that almost destroyed Thor at Loki's command. Those are called destroyer too, but they are destroyers on a teeny tiny scale. The destroyer that I am talking about is the destroyer of the entire universe. And of course, that is Shiva. Shiva is part of the Holy Trinity that takes care of the universe, together with Vishnu the preserver and Brahma the creator. Anyway, our story begins not with Shiva himself, but with Brahma. Brahma, besides creating the universe, also created several children. And some of those children ended up very famous indeed. Shameless plug here, but the most famous of whom, I would argue, is myself. Yup, I am Brahma's son. Not something I should be proud of if you've listened to all of Brahma's blunders throughout the show. But I'm not going to talk a lot about Brahma. Instead, I'm going to talk about the other black sheep of the family, who was a goat. Daksha wasn't born a goat, and neither did he completely transform into one. You'll see what I mean later on. Daksha had an unusual birth. He was born from Brahma's thumb. If you're wondering how that is even possible, don't even bother. Just because my dad has got the powers of creation, he likes to show off a bit. Despite having an unusual birth, Daksha had a normal childhood. Eventually, he married Prasuti, who was the daughter of Manu and another of my dad's creations, Shatarupa. Just a quick note, this Manu was not the same Manu from our very first episode, Unicorn Fish. See show notes for more on that. Daksha and Prasuti had many children, one of whom was Sati. Usually, children have different priorities. Some like to play with dolls, and some like to read. Others like to play some kind of sport. The only theme Sati was interested in was Shiva. She was absolutely a fan of Shiva. She was a bigger fan of Shiva than I am of Vishnu. At least I find time to do non-Vishnu things, like this podcast. But Sati was absolutely devoted to Shiva. This continued into adulthood. She had Shiva posters on her bedroom, she wore Shiva merchandise, her notebooks and textbooks at school were covered with Shiva stickers. This continued into adulthood. At dinner one night, Daksha and Prasuti brought up the topic that it was time for Sati to marry. Sati looked around her, at her Shiva-themed dinner plate, and the Shiva cola she was drinking, and the bowl of Mount Kailas ice cream, and she made a silent and sudden decision. She would only marry Shiva and no one else. Sati knew that her parents would not understand if she told them. So, she had to take matters into her own hands. And she knew exactly how to do that. She had seen, as we have on the show, that rishis had had plenty of success praying to members of the Trinity. Hashtag Brahma was trending higher than hashtag Shiva. That's probably because Brahma was a lot more generous than either Shiva or Vishnu. But Sati's focus was entirely on Shiva. She set up a calm, quiet place and began meditating. Years passed. Nothing could break her concentration. Not pleas from her parents, nor basic things like hunger and thirst. Rain or shine, she kept on. Ultimately, Shiva heard her and responded. Only after he appeared before her did Sati open her eyes. After all those years of keeping them closed, the light must have been hurtful, but Sati was beyond pain. She greeted Shiva warmly and, in answer to his question, expressed that all she wanted was to be married to him. Shiva readily agreed, but he did caution her first about the harsh life on Mount Kailash. It's cold, incredibly cold, even at the height of summer. I do have a great home security system though, he said, gesturing at Nandi. I travel frequently to see my devotees and to go destroy parts of the universe and so on. Ooh, and speaking of which, I just love dancing, especially the Tandav, he added. None of that seemed in any way objectionable to Sati. In fact, big fan that she was, she probably had a better idea of Shiva's home and his habits and interests than Shiva realized. The only thing left was to get an okay from Daksh and Prasuti. Normally, that's something that would be initiated by the groom's parents. But Shiva decided to have Brahma be his spokesperson. Now, say what you will about my dad. He may be terrible at granting wishes. Almost always, he's granted all kinds of superpowers to supervillains. But he's a really great negotiator. Daksh had serious apprehensions about the idea of his daughter marrying Shiva. It gives me the chills, he said, not least because of the below freezing temperatures on Mount Kailash. Daksha's primary concerns were about Shiva himself. He did not consider the Lord of Destruction to be the son-in-law one presents at the annual King's Convention. I mean, Daksha said, look at his appearance. A snake around his neck, greasy hair with the moon on it, and a river flowing through it, and a third eye. The third eye particularly made Daksh nervous. Daksh just didn't understand the purpose of the eye. Was this evolution gone wrong? What was that third eye in Shiva's forehead? It was always closed, but why was it there? And Shiva's followers, the Shivadutas, looked and smelled terrible according to Daksha. If Shiva and Sati were visiting, he didn't want to host all the Shivadutas in his palace. But Brahma, the silver-tongued negotiator, spoke to him for hours. Sure, Kailash was in a generally cold area, but Shiva's home was actually quite comfortable, and the views from the top were amazing. It had been featured in the anniversary edition of the Luxury Homes magazine. It had even gotten 4.5 stars. And what did personal appearance have to do with anything? Shiva was just being Shiva. Had Daksha considered that maybe the problem was with himself and not with Shiva's appearance? Besides, how many kings at the King's Convention could actually claim that their daughter was married to a member of the Holy Trinity? It was probably this last point which changed Daksha's mind. He was still reluctant, but finally agreed to the marriage because it would certainly boost his ranking in the King's Club leaderboard. He might even make it all the way to the top of the board. Turns out, though he got a boost, Daksha didn't make it to the top. That left him a little bitter. During the marriage, Daksh observed Shiva. Shiva had ash smeared on his body and was looking just like Daksha had described him. All of Daksha's feelings about Shiva's appearance came rushing back. And Shiva's followers were a lot worse, in Daksha's opinion. He made a silent promise never to invite Shiva over. And by extension, that meant never inviting Sati over either. Just such an occasion came up a few months later. Daksha decided to perform a major sacrifice. This would have been a grand event for any king. It was about expanding his kingdom, building relations with other kings, with the gods, and having a grand party that everyone who was anybody was invited to. Everyone except Shiva and Sati. Daksha didn't care how his daughter would feel if she heard about the party from her neighbors or her pen pals. The answer to the question Daksha didn't bother with was that Sati felt extremely puzzled. Yeah, she was wondering why her milkmaid, the cleaning lady, the nearby pawn shop guy, they had all received invitations to Daksha's party, but she had not. She thought about it and came to the conclusion that this was not an oversight, but her father must have decided to dispense with formality. Or maybe the postal service had lost the mail. Or they were taking too long. After all, Mount Kailas was a hard place to climb. Maybe she should talk to Shiva about setting up a mailbox at the bottom of the mountain, rather than at the top. When Sati explained to Shiva that they must go to her parents' palace for the party, Shiva did not share her enthusiasm. Clearly, he had a better idea about what Daksha had intended by not inviting them. But he could not talk her out of it. Sati's mind was made up, and she simply couldn't accept his explanation that Daksha genuinely didn't want them there. Ultimately, they decided that Sati would go and Shiva would stay back. But Sati would be accompanied by some Shivadutas, because it was a long journey. It took several days, but Sati and the Shivadutas made it just in time to the party. And what a party it was! There was a grand hall that seemed to stretch in every direction for miles. And there were thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people there. Definitely a pre-COVID scenario. In the very center of the hall was a huge flame, around which several rishis sat. They were chanting a number of different shlokas, or prayers, and at appropriate points, pouring common household ingredients like ghee, milk, and sugar into the fire. That's basically how these parties went. This particular one was to ensure a longer reign for Daksha and a stable one. Sati stepped in, and some heads turned. Some guests greeted her warmly, while others nodded politely. But most had no idea who she was. This last group was puzzled at the appearance of the Shivadutas, who looked, well, let's just say that they were not conforming to the dress code. Finally, Sati located her parents and approached them. Daksh and Prasuti were surprised to see her, and Sati was surprised by their surprise. But Sati was sensible. She decided not to bring it up right away. She'd raise it to them after the party. Keep it all within the family, so to speak. Prasuti hurriedly signaled a maid to go and set up an extra place at the dinner table for Sati. Daksh completely ignored his daughter. It was very awkward. He was seen smiling and greeting all other guests. He was casual with all of his other children. It was only Sati who was being ignored. This was too much for Sati to bear, as she realized that the absence of an invitation was intentional. Daksh did not want her there. Shiva had been right, and she had overridden him and come anyway. She had seen hatred for the first time in her father's eyes. Hatred towards her, her husband, his way of life, his followers. Come to think of it, she had seen it in Daksha's eyes on her wedding day too. She had dismissed it as a trick of the light. How could she have not realized this before? She asked herself. The only path forward for her was to go out with an impact. Daksh would be forced to notice her. She stepped closer to the great fire. I'm going to a place where daughters are respected. Goodbye, cruel world, she said. But her gaze was firmly fixed on her parents. Daksh and Prasuti thought they knew what she meant. They thought they meant the world to her, and she was renouncing them. She was leaving the party. Hooray, thought Daksh. But he wasn't prepared for what happened next, because Sati stepped right into the fire. She disappeared in a flash. One moment she was there, and the next she had vaporized. There were loud cries in the hall. Most people were shocked, but it was the Shivadutas who were the most anguished. They couldn't believe their eyes. They had been tasked by Shiva to protect Sati, and they had failed. They wailed loudly. Of all the people, the least affected was Daksh. He went to the extent of not caring that he had just lost his daughter. He instead signaled for his guards to eject the Shivadutas, and the guards obeyed. Shiva's followers rushed back to Kailash. This was not something they could try to handle on their own. Shiva was meditating when the Dutas reached Kailash and broke the news that Sati was no more. Shiva was absolutely furious when he heard all the details. His followers had never seen him so angry. And then Shiva began to dance. That might have been a strange reaction by a husband who had just lost his wife. But it was absolutely the reaction everyone expected from the Lord of Destruction. He was dancing the Tandav, the dance that could destroy all of creation. Luckily for Brahma, who would otherwise have to create the entire universe all over again, Shiva stopped after just a few steps. His dance had the effect of not destroying anything, but of creating. Sounds counterintuitive? Well, Shiva created two creatures, Veerabhadra and Bhadrakali. They were agents of destruction, created with the express purpose of getting revenge. If you've seen the Marvel movies, imagine the Hulk. Take out whatever little humanity he had and amplify the rage about 100 times. If you do that, you'll get Veerabhadra. Bhadrakali was about the same, but a female version. The two of them rushed to Daksha's party. Meanwhile, at Daksha's party, the rishis had to start all over after Sati's grand departure. It disrupted everything because their fire had been used for a purpose that they had not intended. The rishis complained about it being a trifle disruptive and grumbled about the miserly Daksha not having listened to them when they asked for a security barricade around the fire. But they kept a stiff upper lip and carried on. Right when they had set a good pace and were halfway through their shlokas for a second time, there was another disruption. It was Veerabhadra and Bhadrakali. To call them disruptive would be putting it mildly. They spared no one. It was like watching a Quentin Tarantino movie. So I'll spare you all the details. All I'll say is that at some point, Veerabhadra decapitated Daksha and threw his head into the fire. The rishis frowned at this and protested loudly, but became quiet the moment Veerabhadra turned to face them with a very bloody sword. The next morning, Veerabhadra and Bhadrakali had retired, their jobs completed. Shiva came in. He figured he could enter now. There was no one left alive who could have invited him, so it must surely be okay to just walk in. He looked around at the destruction his anger had caused, and he thought to himself, what would Sati have said? Surely, she wouldn't have wanted this to happen to everyone at the party. So he decided to forgive them. He took a special powder and blew it all around him. Instantly, all the wounds healed, and the party guests started getting up, as if waking up from sleep. Completely healed now. All except Daksha. Daksha was missing a head, thanks to Veerabhadra, who had promptly tossed it in the fire. But Shiva had the perfect solution for this. He took the head of a goat, which was one of the animals that was part of the rituals. Performing one of the earliest head transplants in history, he transferred it to his father-in-law's body. Meh, Daksha said. Ah, yes, Shiva thought. I'll need some translation. He took another powder and blew it at Daksha's goat face, and instantly the bleats were transformed into words. Daksha apologized for the way he had treated Sati and Shiva. He said he had been very unfair and had realized it before the loss of his own human head. And to prove that he didn't care about people's appearances anymore, he would be content with his goat head. So be it, Shiva said, and blessed his father-in-law. Which is unusual because normally the direction of the blessing is the other way around. Daksha asked about Sati, and Shiva assured her that she was fine. She had just transformed and is now being born to another king. They'll name her Parvati. But if you want to learn more about what happens to her, wait for a future episode of Narad's podcast. I'm sure he'll cover it. And Shiva's right, I definitely will. That's all we have time for this week. The Manu who was Prasuti's father is Swayambhuva Manu, and he's not the same as the one in episode 1, Unicorn Fish. The one who met the unicorn fish was Vaivasvata Manu. There have been and will be many other Manus. I had described the role of Manu back when he was Character of the Week in episode 33. That's all for now. In the next episode, I'm very excited to start on Chandrakanta. Chandrakanta is a work of fiction. It's a fantasy story upon which a very popular TV series was based. If you have comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories that you would like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or tweet at sfipodcast. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. I'll see you next time.